The first thing I actually want to do is recognize, pay tribute, just say something about Kamani Gray, who is a 16-year-old black man who was murdered by the NYPD this week in Flatbush, Brooklyn. There's a number of people at a vigil out there for him tonight. He was shot 7 times in the back, it turns out, by the police. Their story has changed many, many times over. There will be an announcement about vigils and ongoing actions against police brutality, but I felt like I couldn't give a talk tonight without remembering and talking about and paying tribute. And I can't say now exactly how that's connected to the topic of this, although I hope that by the end of the talk it will be clear. But just as a human being, as anyone who fights oppression and injustice, I think we have to start with the basic premise that an injustice to anyone, anywhere, is an injustice to everywhere, everyone, everywhere. So anyway, I just wanted to begin with that because it's been a difficult week in the news. So having said that, I want to begin by quoting a powerful editorial in the New York Times condemning our epidemic of rape and sexual violence. The New York Times wrote this: The brutal gang rape of a young woman in Steubenville, Ohio last summer has cast a cold light on how badly America treats its women. This reprehensible crime reflects an alarming trend in the U.S., which basks in its reputation as a defender of democracy, but tolerates shocking abuse of women. Many victims, shamed into silence and callously disregarded by a male-dominated power structure, never go to the authorities to seek justice. Women are routinely blamed for inciting the violence against them. The U.S. must work on changing a culture in which women are routinely devalued. The U.S., an economic superpower and the world's greatest democracy, can never reach its full potential if half its population lives in fear of unspeakable violence. Now, these are very powerful words, and in many ways I can't take issue with this editorial, except for one central objection. This editorial was actually written about the gang rape case in Delhi, India. But if you substitute America/US for India, the words offer up a damning indictment of the sexism that pervades our society. Perhaps more damning, however, is the fact that the New York Times, one of the most prestigious and widely read papers in the US, does not see fit to discuss this reality. Instead, they chose to run this piece yesterday. Case already tried in social media heads to court. In it, the author piously proclaims that the defendants, quote, who have pleaded not guilty, have already been accused, prosecuted, defended, and judged guilty or not by their peers and strangers in blog posts, YouTube videos, and entries on Facebook, Twitter, and other sites. Oh, the poor, poor rapists. They've been subjected to the court of public opinion, which presumably has unfairly judged them based merely on videos showing an unconscious young woman dragged by her hands and ankles, Twitter feeds bragging about the rape, and video footage of other young men joking that the young woman was, quote, so raped she's dead. Please, New York Times, tell me how I have misunderstood this. Tell me why I should not be horrified and enraged at this brutal gang rape and instead should be wringing my hands over a story complicated by social media. Because obviously the country's paper of record has more to tell us than Facebook. For example, their article ends with this priceless gem, a quote from one of the defense attorneys. But Mr. Nemens said that whatever the outcome, he doubted that the tensions would be entirely resolved. No one wins on either side, he said. Everybody loses on these types of cases. I'm sorry, but no, that's not true. Do you know who's losing in this case? The young woman who was raped. It's bad enough that she was dragged unconscious from one party to another and repeatedly violated, while the whole thing was live tweeted, taped, and joked about. But now she is living under virtual house arrest because of the extreme number of death threats she has received. Her mother reports that she's scared to go to school and she can't even sleep at night. And now the defense is planning to put her on trial, claiming that she was a drunk, out-of-town football groupie who chose to go to parties with these boys and that this somehow constitutes consent. And to add yet another insult to injury, they have requested in court that she be referred to not as the victim, but as the accuser. Well, I'm with a comrade who posted on Facebook, I'm going to start referring to the defendants as the alleged human beings and Jane Doe as the incredibly brave survivor. But of course, the New York Times tells us none of this. we are not offered a single story or anecdote that might humanize the survivor or any facts that might place this crime in context. In fact, in case you were wondering, I'm into counting recently, in the entire article, there are precisely 14 words related to the victim and her family. 3,000-word article, 14 words about the woman whose life is being destroyed. So that's the liberal establishment. Meanwhile, over at Fox News, the Hannity Show decided to take up the cause of women, dedicating an entire segment to the need to arm women so that they can shoot their attackers. Leaving aside the fact that I don't believe Fox News would take any too kindly to it if women were just to start shooting their attackers. You know, high school girls shooting football players, college-age women shooting men at keggers, wives shooting husbands, women in the military shooting their fellow officers and commanding officers. You know, leaving that aside, the segment spoke directly to a key aspect of the narrative of rape in our country, which is that the men who commit it are just evil monsters. We can't explain it. It doesn't come from anywhere. So when Zerlina Maxwell, who is a guest on the show, who's like my new hero, suggested that perhaps it was time to stop asking women to be responsible for preventing their own rape and instead teach men not to rape, Hannity and the other gun-loving guests laughed right in her face. They explained to her that this was completely unrealistic because there are just some evil people out there. Now, I will grant you that you watch the videos from Steubenville and it's stomach-wrenching. But the descriptions of the young men as sick sociopaths and monsters leaves us ill-equipped to actually talk about the reality of rape and sexual violence in our country. It avoids the hard questions. What is it in our society that creates such monsters? Surely these boys weren't born this way. And what about when the rapists are not monsters, but popular athletes, straight-A students, your military commanding officer, someone's boyfriend or husband? While it's seen as perfectly acceptable to blame rape in India or other countries as the result of uniquely misogynistic cultures, we are really only offered two narratives for thinking about rape in our country. One is the horrible monster, the stories that get sensationalized, and I think we have to keep in mind that the issues of race and class, and I'll come back to this, in particular play a role in determining which cases make the headlines and which don't. And then on the other hand, we're offered a narrative of rape as a result of sexual miscommunication, confused gender roles, excessive alcohol use among young people, and the hookup culture. And this framing of the issue of rape and sexual violence represents a massive step backwards, I would argue. Before the women's movement, the dominant idea of rape was that it was something that happens in dark alleys and bad neighborhoods by strangers. In fact, probably the most dominant image of rape was the racist mythology of the black sexual predator violating the purity of white women. There was no such thing as date rape in popular consciousness and not really in the law. It's worth remembering that up until 1976, I know that's less than 40 years ago because I was alive at the time, marital rape was legal in every single state in this country. That is, legally there was no such thing as marital rape, which kind of gives a new meaning to the vow to love, honor, and obey. The women's movement punctured that mythology and revealed the truth that most rapes happen between people who know each other, and that's much more common than people think. This represented a huge advance, and I think really brought the issue of rape and sexual assault to the forefront of society. But the massive backlash against the gains of that movement have really, I think, taken us backwards in a major way. They've changed the way in which rape and sexual assault are talked about. And today, the myth of stranger rape has been replaced by new rape myths, most central of which, I think, is the myth of what's called gray rape. And this is an idea that's hard to identify what constitutes consent or non-consent, and that many of the situations that might be rape are murky or confusing. This way of talking about rape and sexual assault situates it within the framework of interpersonal relationships and communication, or miscommunication. So in the early 1990s, there was a woman named Katie Roesch. Actually, she still exists. But she wrote a book called The Morning After, which essentially claimed that date rape didn't really exist. Instead, according to Roesch, date rape really represented a phenomenon of women who woke up the next morning and changed their mind. She wrote, quote, "There is a gray area in which one person's rape may be another person's bad night. She argued that women were not willing to take responsibility for their own sexual activity and instead reverted to accusations of rape. And in fact, she even went so far to say, talking about date rape re-victimizes women because it assumes that they are not able to take sexual control of their own life in the way that men are. Her argument was shocking at the time, but now some of the incredibly reactionary assumptions that she peddled have seeped into the mainstream discussion. Of all media outlets, it was the women's magazine Cosmopolitan, which is usually populated by articles on the most contorted and physically uncomfortable ways possible to please your man, was the first to identify this, quote, new form of rape. In a cover article, the author Laura Sessions Stepp, and remember that name, she is a key backlash author, lays out the basic argument. She wrote, "Many experts feel that gray rape is in fact often a consequence of today's hookup culture. Lots of partying and flirting, plenty of alcohol, and, ironically, the idea that women can be just as bold and adventurous about sex as men are. How can something so potentially empowering become so damaging?" So the narrative goes, as women have become more sexually active, use of alcohol has increased, and there's an increasing, quote, hookup culture. Confusion has developed over what constitutes consent. There's all sorts of gray areas, and sometimes men, they cross the line. No one's quite clear on whether it was rape or not. He's not quite sure, did she consent or didn't she? And there's a right-wing version of this narrative and a liberal one that's cloaked in concern for women. The right-wing argument essentially tells women that if you're going to play with the big boys, then you're going to get hurt. So the same Cosmopolitan article quotes a woman saying, quote, "If you make the choice to leave the bar with the guy, then you are also creating the opportunity for something to go wrong. I think that this is the point that needs to be driven home to everyone who participates in the hookup culture. Yes, you can practice safe sex. Yes, you can have casual sex without strings, but this behavior carries a risk." And I would just say that that logic is the same logic that the defense attorneys are about to use in the trial in Steubenville. She should have known she shouldn't have crossed town lines. When she chose to get in the car with those guys and go to the party and start drinking, she should have known her behavior carries risk. So women who have casual sex are engaging in, quote, risky behavior. The implication being that if something goes wrong, you have to accept the consequences of your actions. And as horrific as this argument might appear to most people, the assumption that women are responsible for engaging in risky behavior that could lead them to being victims of rape or sexual assault underlies much of the mainstream handling of the question. At first-year orientations at colleges across the country, women are taught tips for how to avoid putting themselves in a dangerous situation, are told about the risks of alcohol and how to look out for friends. And sometimes this goes to obscene extremes. For example, the Colorado Springs advice to its female students, apparently when faced with a rape, women should vomit or pee on themselves. Helpful, right? Orientation workshops telling men that rape and sexual assault will not be tolerated on their campus and how to ask for consent, practically non-existent. It's easier to label it victim blaming when a police officer calls his sex crimes unit the, quote, lying bitches unit, as the Philadelphia cop in charge of this unit did in the 1990s, or when a judge dismisses a claim of rape because the victim's vagina wasn't shredded enough, or when a Republican representative says that some women just rape easy. I think most people would recognize those as vile victim-blaming statements, hopefully. But what about when a university administrator describes the problem of rape on campus this way? Quote, "It's very common for them to go out Wednesday through Saturday at a minimum, drink fairly heavily, and hook up sexually with people that they may not know particularly well, may have met for the first time that night, or had been introduced through friends or MySpace or Facebook. So you have a lot of sexual activity, you have alcohol, you have a population that's sort of at an at-risk age, and in some ways is a perfect storm for sexual assault issues. So here we have a set of factors. Alcohol, social media, lots of sexual activity, all of which presumably are contributed to by both men and women. What's the one factor missing from this list? Sexism, the constant degradation and objectification of women and their bodies. This is the real risk factor for rape and sexual assault. But this thinking that rape is a result of confused sexual relations, alcohol, and miscommunication shapes the way in which it's responded to, especially on campus where rates of sexual assault are even higher than in society as a whole. Statistics have them at somewhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 women on campus will be the victim of a sexual assault or rape. The same professor I just quoted had this to say about how to handle allegations of sexual assault on campus. He said, "What surprised me was how many people have made terrible mistakes and can actually learn to be better people from that there's still a chance for teachable moments." But important research has been done that shows that men who rape are not confused about sexual boundaries at all. This research shows that it's actually a fairly small minority of men who rape, between 6 and 13%. More dramatically, a large majority of these men rape multiple times, an average around 6 rapes each. On campuses, it's estimated that they account for about 90% of the rapes. Just digest that for a sec. A tiny minority of men responsible for 90% of the rapes. These men were not confused at all. They all identified as having used force or alcohol to get women to have sex with them without consent, but they didn't label their actions rape, and they genuinely believed that they were entitled and supported by the broader culture. And tragically, they're right. So treating sexual assault as a result of confusion and miscommunication, or as a teachable moment, is fundamentally flawed. When only 15% of men found guilty of sexual assault in a campus disciplinary proceeding faced expulsion, not 15% of men accused, 15% of men found guilty face expulsion. And many, many more cases are never even taken seriously or are dismissed as an unsolvable he said, she said. It protects these rapists and allows them to rape again. Moreover, it does nothing to actually address the sexist culture that leads to rape, and it leads rapists to feel that they can act with impunity. It reinforces the culture of victim blaming, and this is a critical point, because one person's teachable moment is another's trauma. And this, the experience of survivors, is completely erased from the discussion of sexual assault in this country. Witness the New York Times article I quoted. While most men who rape on campus are able to finish their studies, large numbers of women leave school for fear of having to attend classes or live in dorms with their assailant. Women who report their sexual assaults often find themselves re-victimized by the criminal justice system. And even for those who do not report their assaults, and the vast majority do not, there are often devastating consequences. Almost 1/3 of women who have been sexually assaulted will suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder or a major depressive episode at least once in their lifetime. The majority live in fear of friends or relatives finding out what happened to them, and most suffer more daily effects on self-esteem, ability to trust, sexual functioning, sleep disorders, and more. A real response to the epidemic of rape and sexual violence in our society today has to start by putting that experience back at the center of the discussion. It has to reject any notion that there are gradations of assault in which some forms can be more legitimately described as rape. It has to reject victim blaming and that the idea that it is in any way a woman's responsibility to prevent a rape or sexual assault from happening to her. Only then can we begin a real discussion about why some men rape and what our broader culture does to make that acceptable. And here I want to return to the dichotomy I discussed earlier, the monster on the one hand and the confused young man on the other. The university administrator who's so committed to teachable moments does believe there are real rapists. He says he worked as an attorney in criminal courts where he'd see criminals who were, quote, incorrigible, and who made him kind of grateful that we have jails and we're still building them. But those men were different than the ones he'd routinely see being disciplined on college campuses, bright young men who had made a mistake. And so we're right back where we were before the women's movement. Rape is something that happens out there. Of course, there's an astounding level of racism involved in this assumption as well, because nearly every time that the media wants to put a face on rape that happens out there, they put a black or a brown face on it. And we have to say that our society doesn't give a damn about the futures of certain young men. Here in New York City, when a woman was raped while jogging in Central Park in 1989, the media went into a frenzy, and the cops went on a brutal racist spree. They rounded up 5 black teenagers, detained them without access to their parents, and forced false confessions from them. These children had their young lives stolen from them and were only proven innocent years after they served their sentences. The media campaign was intensely and viciously racist, calling them savages and brutes. It would not be an exaggeration to describe it as a lynch mob mentality. Donald Trump took out a full-page ad calling for the reinstatement of the death penalty just for these teenagers. It was as if New York City in 1989 was the Deep South of the 1930s. But it's not just that they see nothing to destroying the lives of these young black men. the lives of black women are also treated as less in our society. In the same week as the Central Park jogger was attacked, there were 28 other reports of first-degree rape in New York City. In one case, a woman was raped, sodomized, and thrown 50 feet from a four-story building, barely surviving. Like most of the other 28 cases, she was a woman of color, and it didn't get anywhere near the level of attention as the Central Park jogger. In a country literally based on the most profound violence and racism, this racism is shot through the entire discussion and treatment of violence against women. Critically, the idea that rape is something out there obscures, minimizes, and outright erases the reality of rape that happens in here, which encompasses some of the most powerful institutions and cultural forms in our society. The military, where 1 in 3 women is a victim of sexual assault, our prisons, campuses, among athletes, and crucially in the home and in our intimate relationships. As Zerlina Maxwell put it, she said, "The young men in Steubenville aren't monsters. They did something monstrous and criminal, but perhaps we should begin to stop repeating the notion that criminals are the ones raping 1 in 5 women. No, it's our husbands, boyfriends, acquaintances, relatives, and friends, and they rape because they are not taught to see women as full, autonomous human beings." This really is the idea that the women's movement popularized 35 years ago, along with the idea that yes means yes and no means no, whatever we wear, wherever we go. So how is it that we've gotten to this point where we're back arguing over the basic definition of rape and the right for women not to be raped? How is it that they can launch a defense in Steubenville that claims that a woman who was clearly unconscious, was videotaped and witnessed being unconscious, somehow was in a position to consent to sex? And I think that for this, we really have to go back to the contradictory outcomes of the women's liberation movement and what we accomplished and what we didn't accomplish and the work that's still to be done. The women's movement won some tremendous gains. It broke down many of the barriers to formal equality, and I think you can see the result today with more women in politics, corporate boardrooms, and other positions of power. But not just that, it won real changes in women's lives. The right to divorce, abortion rights, sexual freedom. There's so many ways in which women's lives today would be unrecognizable to our mothers and our grandmothers. But the gains of the movement were always limited. But even more importantly, those gains, and especially the ones with the widest impact, you think about abortion rights, which is something that benefits all women and disproportionately benefits working class women who most need the access. Those gains have been under a sustained assault. The decades following the social movements of the 1960s and early 1970s were marked by an aggressive neoliberal assault. And this was both a response to the onset of economic crisis in the late 70s, but also an ideological response to the social movements. The social movements completely shook up society. You had a black power movement offensive. You had a women's liberation movement offensive, a gay liberation movement, people demanding that the entire system be changed, turned upside down, that people's rights be recognized, that people have freedom, etc. And so this was a response to that. Put as briefly as possible, neoliberalism is the idea that for capitalism to effectively function, you have to let the market rip. Get rid of all market regulations, social and welfare provisions, any kind of measures to protect workers. And then the ideological corollary to this is the notion of personal responsibility. If you're in a tough situation, it must be something that you did. The market is neutral. No one's going to help you. If you just try hard enough, you can succeed. And on both the economic and ideological level, this had a profound impact on how the aftermath of the women's liberation movement played out. Structurally, this backlash reinforced the inequality between men and women in the productive sphere, that is at work, equal pay provisions, any kind of provisions that would protect women at work, while also eliminating or forestalling social protections. For example, welfare. We saw the end of welfare as we know it in 1996 under Bill Clinton. Child care subsidies, the idea of any kind of paid parental leave program or provisions for parents in this country just was off the table. Anything that could have helped to raise the status of women. At the same time, neoliberal ideology propounded a notion that we live in a post-sexist society, that women had achieved freedom and could, quote, have it all. We were told to discard the victim mentality of the past, and embraced our power and freedom. This went along with capitalism's tendency and neoliberalism's almost unparalleled ability to commodify all social relationships, including sexuality itself. Thus, we've seen the rise of what people have referred to as raunch culture, which has perversely been able to wrap itself in the mantle of women's sexual expression and freedom. So you have these ideas and these notions of women's sexual freedom completely delinked from any notion of equality or rights that women might have. And so we need to understand these two things together to understand how both the reality of women's lives today and the ideology of it are shaped. It's become popular to talk about our society as a rape culture. And this idea has very helpful aspects to it. I think most centrally, positioning rape and sexual assault as systemic rather than individual. I think a lot of times when people talk about rape culture today, what they're saying is this isn't just individual men. There's something fundamentally wrong with our society. And, you know, certainly we live in a society saturated by sexism, just witness the Oscars. And we live in a world saturated by sex. It's used to sell everything. In fact, it's kind of astounding the range of totally non-sexual items that women's bodies are used to sell. But our culture is also contradictory because you have that sexism on the one hand, and then you have images of women's empowerment as well. I'm the parent of a teenage girl, and so not recently, but like 4 or 5 years ago, I spent a lot of time watching the Disney Channel. Now, the Disney Channel is just populated by these like gutsy, spunky, independent, talking back like women, young girls. I mean, Hannah Montana. You just go down the list. It's like kind of astounding to watch these like role models of like empowerment and autonomy. And so you have that, and then those girls grow up into a society that completely devalues them and where the reality they face is completely demeaning. It's incredibly contradictory. So in the United States today, the idea of a post-sexist society coexists with profound levels of inequality and oppression. And this attitude, I think, or an example of this was really summed up in a piece by Hannah Rosen. In an article titled, "Marissa Mayer Thinks Feminism is a Drag. Is she right?" Do people know who Marissa Mayer is, the Yahoo CEO? Yeah. Okay. What was it? Feminism is a drag. Is she right? So Hannah Rosen tells us, maybe feminism is a term too freighted with history, and it's time to move on. Because, you know, it wouldn't be Women's History Month without yet another barrage of articles declaring the end of feminism. Now, just to be clear, Hannah Rosen is the same woman who wrote a book declaring the end of men, and that women had essentially achieved equality, and now it was all about individual choice. And really, if anybody's oppressed, it's the poor men. They are having it so bad. But this idea fits very neatly with the idea that we live in a post-sexist society. And yet the reality of the world we live in would seem to contradict that. It is incredibly enraging, confusing, and outright debilitating to live as a woman in this society and told that if you're angry about the way you are treated, you either just don't have a sense of humor or you're an out-of-date feminist with a chip on your shoulder, and it's time to just move on. But we have to ask why, with all of the tremendous changes in women's lives, sexism still exists. And this is where I would argue that we have to understand rape culture as a starting point and not an end to the discussion. Because to only talk about culture is to leave certain questions unanswered. Most importantly, how do cultures get produced and how can they be changed? I'm a Marxist. Marxists argue that culture is rooted in material reality. That is, how societies are structured to meet their basic needs, how our system basically operates, how people go to work and produce things and meet their needs, actually gives rise, not in a direct one-to-one way, but gives rise to the kind of cultural ideas that exist in our society. So in our society, under capitalism today, the privatized nuclear family is absolutely central to the functioning of this system. All the social functions of our society are privatized within the family. The raising of the next generation, the basic day-to-day care that allows people to get up and go to work each morning, the care of the elderly and the sick. All of this is the responsibility of individuals. And historically, it was women who were responsible for the bulk of this work, while men are expected to go out and earn an income to support the family. And now, even though women are a permanent and substantial part of the workforce, the expectation is still that women are the primary caregivers, and society is structured on that basis. So all that burden, now a double burden with work outside and inside the home, is placed on women, okay? And, just so people know, like $3 trillion a year is what the UN Economic Development Report estimates women's unpaid labor to contribute to society. $3 trillion a year. And so I would argue that sexism, the sexist ideas that are all around us, they don't just come from nowhere. They're not just bad ideas in people's heads. They're actually an ideological product of this reality. Because if you have to have this idea that you have a nuclear family with a male breadwinner and a woman who stays home and takes care of the kids and takes care of the house, even if that reality doesn't exist, then you need to have a whole set of sexist stereotypes ranging from the somewhat nicer ideas that women are more nurturing, they're more caring, et cetera, but also we're the weaker sex, et cetera, we don't belong in the workplace, and all the rest of that. And it's not just bad ideas, it's reinforced in myriad and small and large ways, even independent of the will of the people involved. So because our society is structured in such a way that women are the ones that are expected to stay home with a sick kid or take time off from work in order to raise their kids, that means that you have to have more contingent jobs, more temporary jobs, more flexible jobs. Those are the jobs that pay less. Those are the jobs in the pink economy. Because you make less, then when your kid is sick, you're more likely to be the partner who stays home. And so it's a vicious circle that reinforces itself. And today, this situation has reached kind of intense proportions because the nuclear family is under tremendous pressure, and in some ways it doesn't even really exist. I mean, 50% of families are headed by households are headed by single mothers. The sort of nuclear family, like married man and woman with the kids, doesn't exist. And yet there's this massive attempt to prop up that ideology to keep the whole thing going. And this is why you see the sort of right-wing backlash, the Republican Neanderthals that really came out of the woodwork in the last election seasons, going on a rampage against abortion rights, access to birth control. They really hate gay marriage, pushing for abstinence-only education. I don't know how many people have seen Bloomberg's subway ads scapegoating teen mothers, because apparently teen mothers are like the problem. We're being told that now there's a marriage gap and single motherhood, and these two things are the cause of every possible ill in society. You know what I mean? Like drug addiction, crime, dropout rates, economic inequality, illiteracy, obesity, you just go on and on. It's all women, you know what I mean? It's these single moms. And so on the one hand, you have this intense social morality pushing this idea of women's traditional role within the family and the traditional nuclear family. And then on the other hand, at the same time, you have women objectified in this sort of girls gone wild voyeurism. You know what I mean? You have these two things side by side. And what it does is it creates a toxic state where women just can't win. Yeah. No matter what you do, you just can't win. And I think that that's the reality that so many people are beginning to be angry about today. I think if we situate the epidemic of rape and sexual assault in this context, it also helps to point towards a framework for how we can begin to combat it. Because I think there's a way you just walk around like the city or anywhere and you're just like, where do I even begin? You know what I mean? Like you look at Steubenville and you're like, this country is going to hell in a handbasket and I don't even know where to start to turn it around. And, in some ways, we've made a lot of progress. Rape, sexual assault, domestic violence, they're actually discussed. Not very well, but they actually are discussed in our society today. The Violence Against Women Act, despite Republican objections, was recently reauthorized with some really important extensions. For example, the expanded rights for Native American women to prosecute their cases in tribal courts, protections for immigrant women. But we also have to say that the political climate of the last 30 years also shaped, and I would argue in some important ways, distorted the response and how we talk about rape and sexual violence. And one of these, I think, is the focus on criminalization as a response to rape. The idea that we need to just make sure that rape is a crime, it's prosecuted to the fullest extent, utilizing the courts, et cetera. And I think that's understandable because there is a real need to recast what had been seen as a personal issue as a crime. It is a crime when men rape and abuse women. But there's real limitations as well. I mean, the first is obviously that it's completely sexist. I mean, you look at what's happening in Steubenville right now, and that's a perfect example. There's also the judge who recently ruled that something wasn't rape because the woman's vagina wasn't shredded enough. There's all sorts of ways in which the system doesn't protect women. But I would also argue that it suffers from being tied into a system that itself is inherently biased and oppressive. So, for example, the Violence Against Women Act was initially passed at the same time as Bill Clinton's crime bill. The crime bill was something that about 20 years ago, the crime bill was something that really began the buildup of mass incarceration in this country. It put billions of dollars into policing and prisons and not into social programs. And those last 20 years, as I've said, have seen a massive buildup of America's prison nation. And so when violence against women is packaged with the war on crime, it has a very real impact. I mean, some of those impacts are simply that women of color are much less likely to go to the court to see the authorities or the police authorities as in any way to be helpful to them, and they're right about that. And you look at the number of cases of police who rape or threaten to rape women, and you can see that very clearly. But it has other more insidious impacts as well. So, for example, there's been a whole move with the rape crisis centers, rape crisis center movement and rape crisis centers, where all of the funding is going into prosecution. So rape crisis centers are reimbursed based on the number of times that their counselors accompany women to court for a prosecution. Information and resource referral is considered a much lower funding priority. And so if you have a homeless woman who comes in who's been raped or sexually assaulted, if you have someone who's in a difficult situation, needs drug rehabilitation or care for her kids, or doesn't have enough money to leave her attacker or her abuser, all of those things are not funded in rape crisis centers today because the entire emphasis is on prosecution and going to court. And again, that has a disproportionate impact on working class women, poor women, and women of color. And that's just one example. There's a lot more to be said about that issue, but I have limited time. But I think it's important to pull out, because the people who run this society want to frame the issue in a particular kind of way for their needs, and I think that we have to reject that. And I think we also have to say, because the criminal injustice system is inherently biased, it inevitably reinforces a division between real rape criminals who have a certain profile in our society and, the confused young men who just need a teachable moment. And I think that we need to sort of begin to go beyond that. And I think the recent discussion of rape culture, teaching men not to rape, all of those kinds of initiatives represents a huge advance. And I think a shift away from that strategy that's incredibly positive. We've seen a proliferation of the sort of yes means yes, consent is sexy, a real focus on sexism and a focus on institutions that victim blame. So, for example, in the last 6 months, I think we've seen a tremendous surge in movements on college campuses to hold college campus administrations, not just the students, but administrations responsible for the kind of climate that they create. We need to fight for, develop, and extend these initiatives. There should be fights for rape crisis centers on every campus in this country. It is an absolute travesty that there exists a single campus in this country that does not have dedicated rape crisis centers. And hint, this is one of them. And in an era of budget cuts, those are the things that they're going to go after. We should be holding college administrations responsible. We should be holding demonstrations and actions in support of the Jane Doe in Steubenville. And we should be rejecting the victim blaming by participating in demonstrations like the slut walks, et cetera. Yeah, we're going to circulate postcards in support of Jane Doe. But we also need to recognize that you can't just fight the culture that exists. At the same time as we're doing those, we have to fight all the different aspects of women's oppression. We have to fight for abortion rights. We have to fight for not just abortion rights, full reproductive justice, the right to have children that you want and be able to take care of them. We have to fight for paid parental leave. We have to fight for equality in the workplace. We have to fight on every single front and extend that, and we need to build coalitions with other people who have also seen this same rollback happen in their movements. I started at the beginning by talking about Kamani Gray and why it was connected. That same rollback of the social movements in the 1960s, that same idea that we live in a post-whatever society, that's true for black people too. We live in a post-racist society. There's been an entire pushback against the Black Power movement that has resulted in the rise of mass incarceration. We need to see these struggles as connected and ultimately, I think, tied to a challenge to a system that relies on that kind of oppression and divisions. And I'll just end by saying, I think we live in strange and barbaric times. In some ways, our lives are unrecognizable to previous generations. There's ways in which, like, the vista for women has opened up in these major ways, and our expectations were raised by the women's liberation movement. And yet things are getting worse and worse and worse. Like I said, I'm the daughter of a teenager. I read about that young girl in Staten Island who, you know, had sex or possibly was raped, is my assumption, by 5 football players. Someone videotaped it and spread it all over the media. And she ended up committing suicide by throwing herself on the subway tracks in Staten Island. That is the result of the kind of culture that our young girls are growing up in. And there's that continuing oppression. But there's also a new resistance growing. And I think that that's really where the hope lies. It lies with the hundreds of people who have gone down to Ohio and stood with the Jane Doe. It lies with, you know, the women on college campuses across this country who are bravely telling their stories and standing up against administrations who would beat them back. The tens of thousands of people in this country and around the world who participated in the slut walks. And I think that the material basis for women's liberation exists. There's no reason why women have to do the cooking and the cleaning. There is enough money out there for us to take care of kids collectively, for us to have full reproductive justice, for everybody to be able to live lives that are meaningful. And we can build a movement and a society where, you know, men and women can collaborate and participate as equals, and the question of actual pleasure, actual communication, actual liberation, not delinked from equality, but actually rooted fundamentally in a material equality, that could exist. That liberation is blocked by a system that is actually bent against that. And I think that that's why the fight against rape culture, against sexual violence has to be a beginning, but we have to go much deeper to win genuine liberation, not just for women, but I think for a whole generation is being destroyed by the society that we live in.